Добрый день.
Добрый день. Last time we were speaking about the death of John the Baptist. We read the pericope about his death, and at the very last moment of our last meeting, I said that next time we will move forward to the next pericope, but Joel Marcus, who was with us, said that no, I still have a lot to tell you about John the Baptist. So, John, now the floor is yours. We are eager to hear your lecture about John the Baptist and his death and the scene that we have read last time.
Well, I don't remember saying that. And I did write a whole book about John the Baptist. I think I said some things about his book. I think we said the most necessary things, that we are in a lucky position with regard to this story, much luckier than with regard to a lot of the stories in Mark, in that we have another account. We have Josephus's account, which, as we said last time, is much more realpolitik in nature. And in that account, Herod put John to death because he felt threatened by him, because John was producing a mass following, and Herod was afraid that he would somehow lead or incite a revolution, and so he put him to death. He tried to, we have an expression in English, nip the problem in the bud. To
What is the English expression?
Nip it in the bud.
That's
the bud on the tree.
Okay, I see.
Want to cut it off early before it produces poison fruit.
Okay.
So that's Josephus's account, and there's, it looks like a plausible political explanation. And as opposed to that, Mark's account, we said last time, is somewhat like a soap opera. You have the dancing girl, you have this drunken party, and you have a leader who doesn't want to put Jesus to death, and that doesn't want to put John to death. And that shows what a great and powerful and charismatic figure John was. And the portrait, as we said last time, is very similar to that of Pontius Pilate in his relation to Jesus. He also doesn't want to put Jesus to death, but he's manipulated into doing so. And then I think the only other thing is the biblical echoes, and it's especially reminiscent of the story of Esther and Ahasuerus, who's also an old king who likes an apparently attractive young woman, and he promises her half of his kingdom. And so we have those elements. So I'm not saying that Mark is totally unhistorical. As I said last time, you could have a situation where, like, say, John's challenge to Herod about his marriage, that also has political ramifications. That could have been partly why he got into trouble with Herod. But it's Mark's story is it's a great story. And when a story is too good, you begin to suspect its historicity. And there's all these additional reasons for suspecting the historicity of it. I guess one other thing I want to say is, yeah, we were talking last time about the kind of almost demonic elements in the story. One of them that I think is interesting is the cutting off of John's head, and then he gives it to the girl, and she gives it to her mother. And some of the terminology is like that of when Jesus divides the loaves, gives them to the disciples, and they give it to the people. So I suggested once that it's kind of a demonic Eucharist. It takes place in a meal, and the head's cut off and it's brought in on a platter. And you do see in medieval iconography pictures that sometimes John's head on the platter looks like a Eucharistic host. So I've said mnogo. Я сказал много. So
Okay.
What do you think of my idea of demonic Eucharist?
I think that the more we look into the plot of Mark's Gospel and compare it with what we saw during our last meeting in the biography of Paul, as it is depicted in Acts, or in the predictions about the future of Jesus' disciples, the future that awaits them, the more we see that consciously or subconsciously, Mark and other early Christian writers draw parallels or organize Jesus, the story of Jesus and the story of John the Baptist here, and the story of Paul in Acts, as one can say, a kind of different versions of the same story. And as concerns the representation of John's death and John's head on the platter as a reminiscence or prefiguration of Eucharist, goes very well with that perspective. I'm more hesitant with regard to your qualification of this Eucharist as demonic Eucharist.
Well, the agents of it are the opponents of Jesus. But I take your point. I think one difference, though, between the story of Jesus and the story of John here is within the story, there's no vindication of John, right? I mean, it's just his disciples come and they bury part of his body, I guess. And so, his vindication is wrapped up with Jesus' vindication and has to wait for that. So I think there's a lot of parallelism, but that's, this story it doesn't end on a triumphant note.
Yes, probably because the fates are very similar to each other, but at the same time, it's clear for the gospel writer that the only plot the only history that should and with that should have a happy end. That's the Jesus story. And all other stories, even when they resemble that of Jesus, they have their culmination and their optimistic end, not within their own development, but within the development of the story of Jesus.
Yes, I agree. And I mean, one idea that I develop in my book, maybe it's the main idea, is I think historically, John the Baptist did have an independent ministry, that he saw himself as a, or even the central figure in the history of salvation. And the early Christians want to create a connection with John, but they also are very interested in subordinating him to Jesus. And you see that most polemically, most strongly in the Gospel of John. He must increase, but I must decrease. John was not the light. He only came to bear witness to the light. And when they come and ask him if he is the Messiah, he confesses. He does not deny. He confesses, so there's this over-determined emphasis on John's subordination to Jesus. And we do know that there were followers of John who did not become part of the Jesus movement. We see them in the book of Acts, and we see them in some second century reports. People still in the second century and on who continued to think that John was, the central figure in the plan of salvation. So I think that partly the emphasis, especially in the Gospel of John, on John's subordination to Jesus is polemical.
Yes, if we see this development between the Gospel of Mark, as most probably the earliest of the Gospels, and that of John, which is probably the latest of the Gospels, how would you explain this development?
I'm not sure that it's chronological, like the John the Baptist movement got stronger, from Mark to John, but just in John's particular situation, there are followers of John the Baptist who he wants to win over to the Christian story. So again, the story was symbolic about a follower of John the Baptist who John points to Jesus and he becomes a follower of Jesus. But I think probably even in Mark, in Mark, the emphasis that John's ministry ended before Jesus' ministry began, I wonder if that was historically true, because in the Gospel of John, despite his polemical emphasis, you have evidence that their ministries overlapped and that Jesus started out baptizing as John was baptizing. So he seems to have started out, I think, historically as an emissary of John, as a continuer of John's ministry. There's still, evidence of a John the Baptist movement strongly in John, but also in Mark, in this progression. First John, then John's out of the way, then Jesus. I think that is also a theological move. And it corresponds to the saying of Jesus in Matthew and Luke about all the prophets were until John, and since then the kingdom of God has been preached. So I don't think it's as much of a concern in Mark as in John, but I think it is a concern in Mark too. It's also a concern in Matthew, where Matthew constructs this story where when Jesus comes to be baptized by John, Matthew says, "What are you doing? I need to be baptized by you." And Jesus says, "Well, thus we must do to fulfill God's righteous plan." But that's also an acknowledgement that, you know, there was a problem actually in Jesus being baptized by John. Several problems. One is, you know, one's initial thought is that the baptizer is more important than the person being baptized. And secondly, what is baptism for? It's for remission of sins. But for the later church, what sins did Jesus have? You know, so there's difficulties with associating Jesus with John, but it's also important for the Christians to insist on the link between John and Jesus. I think because there was a historical link, that Jesus did start out as part of John's ministry. Anyway, it's not all that relevant for our story, but it's fun to think about.
Thank you, Joel. It looks as an invitation for the participants of our seminar to turn to your book in order to read about this more at length.
Yes, I invite you to do that.
Okay. Thank you for your addition to what we were talking about last time, about the pericope, about the death of John the Baptist and its place within the gospel, and the parallelism between the story of John and the story of Jesus, which today we enriched with one more feature in parallel, namely the Eucharistical allusions in the story of Jesus and the head of John the Baptist on the platter.
One other thing, let me quickly add, it's another example of a sandwich in Mark, of an intercalation, because Jesus sends out the disciples, then we have the story of John the Baptist, then the disciples come back and tell Jesus, you know, what happened. So I think that's also a way of reading John into the story of Jesus and connecting these two stories. And maybe a suggestion that the power by which the disciples work miracles and proclaim the gospel when they go out, as described here, that power also flows out of a death. Flows out of the death, not of John the Baptist, but of the one to whom John the Baptist's death points.
Okay, thank you. Then let's go to the next pericope. As usual, we'll bring our virtual parallel edition of Greek and Russian Gospel of Mark. Yes. Who would like to read the Greek text of verse 30. Лариса, хотите?
Могу.
Окей, thank you.
Сейчас мне только плохо видно, я сейчас у себя открою. Так. Кай сюнаган той, гой апостолой, простон Иисус, кай апенгелеян, апенгелан, ауто панта, госе эпоесан, кай госе эдидаксан. Дальше?
Нет, давайте пока остановимся на этом. Апостолы собрались к Иисусу и рассказали ему обо всем, что делали и чему учили. Как Джоэль уже отметил, как мы говорили, здесь перед нами, вот внутри истории, которую мы читаем здесь у Марка, такой своего рода сэндвич, да? То есть у нас история, которую мы читали в прошлый раз, история смерти Иоанна Крестителя, она вставлена внутрь истории про то, как Иисус отправляет учеников на проповедь в начале 6 главы. Да? Вот я сейчас наш экран пролистал назад, да? Призвав к себе 12, он начал отправлять их в путь подвиг. Мы говорили вот про эту главу эрксато, да, который столь характерен для Марка, архумай, и про те потенциальные ассоциации, которые могут быть. Вот, они отправились в путь, проповедуя покаяние, изгнали многих бесов, и многих больных помазали оливковым маслом, и те выздоравливали. И дальше мы видим, внутрь этого текста вставляется история про то, как молва дошла до царя Ирода, и как это связано с убийством, казнью Иоанна Крестителя. А дальше, словно бы, 13 стих, про то, что апостолы изгнали многих бесов, и многих больных помазали оливковым маслом, и те выздоравливали, непосредственно продолжается в 30 стихе, да? Где апостолы собираются к Иисусу и рассказывают ему обо всем, чему, все, что делали и чему учили, да? Словно бы скобки здесь закрываются вокруг истории про отправление апостолов. Вот мы еще не раз увидим внутри Евангелия от Марка эту излюбленную евангелистом технику, когда внутрь какой-то истории вставляется другая, вот то, что называется сэндвич. И, безусловно, у всех исследователей встает вопрос о том, а почему такая странная структура, да? С одной стороны, у нас есть какие-то прообразы этого дела в хиастической организации, собственно, еврейских повествований Ветхого Завета. Но, Joel, you mentioned the sandwich structure.
Странная структура.
Да.
Странная.
Can we guess what was the purpose of this in Mark's Gospel in general, or at least in this particular place?
Well, so I think in general, what the structure does is so you have two stories, you're sandwiching one into the other, and thereby you're creating parallels. You know, you're signaling to the reader that they're meant to be read in light of each other. And so, like, one suggestion I just made was, you know, that in this passage, you know, it's very striking in the first few sentences of chapter 6, Jesus could not perform many miracles, right? He just performed a few miracles because of their unbelief. but the disciples perform many miracles. But by placing the story of the disciples going out and them coming back around the story of John's death, maybe Mark is suggesting that the power for working these miracles, it's a foreshadowing of the power that comes through Jesus' death and resurrection, to which John's death points. So, and I think in general, if you look at these sandwich structures, you can see that they compare two things to each other. For example, in chapter 3, at the end of chapter 3, Jesus' family thinks that he's crazy. Then you have his Jesus' dispute with the scribes about by what power he casts out Satan, and they say that he's possessed. And then you return to the story of the family in verses 31 to 35. So again, the opposition from his family is being compared to, and there's a connection being made with the opposition of his, we could say, political and religious opponents. So I think in all of these cases, you can see comparisons being made, or sometimes contrasts, but I'd say usually comparisons.
So one can say that if one sandwich one story inside another, is it correct in English to say that Mark sandwiches one story within another, or you would use another syntax?
No, that's fine. Yeah, you can say that. Yeah, you can we often make verbs out of nouns, and those who don't like language to change object to that, but yeah, to sandwich one thing inside another is perfectly good English.
Okay, if one sandwich story A within story B, this is an indication that the reader should read these stories in light of each other.
Yeah. Another good example is, near the end, the story of Peter's denial of Jesus, that at the end of chapter 14, that begins with Peter, hanging around a fire, warming himself, and people are starting to identify him as a follower of Jesus. Then you have the story of Jesus' appearance before the Sanhedrin, and then you return to the story of Peter's denial and you finish it. And so that's an example where it's a contrast, because in contrast to Jesus, who says who he is when asked, even though that loses him his life, Peter is afraid and denies. So the two stories are being read in connection with each other, but in that case, I think a contrast is being made between Jesus' forceful confession and Peter's fearful denial.
One thing that suddenly occurred to my mind while talking about this sandwich structure in Mark is the sudden parallel to this technique that we know, that we can see, for example, in traditional Orthodox iconography, where we often have a story depicted on an icon, and then in the background we have another story, often from the life of the same person, which forms a background both in visual terms, is the background on the picture of the icon, but it's also the background of the story that is performed in the foreground. Yes.
Yeah, that's good. You're reading the two stories in light of each other. And yeah, I think it's a very nice way of doing that, because in general, we think if one story follows another, there's a progression. But with this structure, there is a progression, but there's also a circular, there's a circle around it, so that makes it easier to read the two stories in light of each other.
Okay, thank you.
And Mark does it much more than any other gospel. I mean, it's a particular characteristic of Mark, though Matthew and Luke have taken it up in some instances, but not always.
Okay. Этот стих, в котором сейчас остановились, почему я его выделил, и в отличие от того, как у нас обычно принято, просил прочесть его один, он одновременно как бы и закрывает вот этот сэндвич и служит моментом перехода к следующей перикопе, да? Вот. У нас одновременно происходит вот некоторое такое движение вот по той лесенке, вдоль которой, на ступеньках которой выстраивается все Евангелие от Марка. Вот, лестница, которая должна венчаться тем, что мы увидим, что мы прочтем в конце. Вот, и уже за пределами Евангелия от Марка должно венчаться миссией апостолов к язычникам. И вот здесь видим еще один момент. Если я правильно понимаю, у нас этот стих – это как бы первое место, где у нас ученики Иисуса, те самые, которых он послал, называются апостолы. Перед этим говорит, что он избрал таких-то, таких, таких-то и назвал их апостолами. Но вот в речи рассказчика вот это слово уже не как намерение Иисуса избрать каких-то главных учеников своих и наименовать их апостолами, а чтобы это появлялось в речи рассказчика, это, кажется, у нас появляется здесь в Евангелии от Марка впервые. То есть это некое такое продвижение вперед вот по этой лесенке, да?
Can I say one other thing that just occurred to me as you were talking?
Okay.
And maybe you referred to this, but so we have the apostles of Jesus gather back together to him. Is that meant to be a contrast to the apostles of John, who just buried him? A connection, but also a difference, because John is dead now. His story is over. But now the ones who are following the one whose story will not end, they gather back with Jesus. So, again, it might be, a subtle assertion of the superiority of Jesus and his apostles to John and his disciples.
This also gives one more dimension to the comparison between the two stories sandwiched within one another that we talked, because the story sandwiched inside is the story about the end of John's career and the last mention of John's disciples, while the story within which this farewell to John and his disciples is mentioned, the story that frames this farewell to John, is the story of Jesus' disciples continuing that work that John and Jesus according to the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah, I like that, and I'm not sure that I commented on that in my commentary, so I'll have to add something if there's ever another edition.
Oh, yes, I think that one of the tasks of our seminar is to push you to prepare a newer edition of your commentary, incorporating some of the things that we have been discussing here.
I'll get to work on it right away.
Agreed.
No, thank you for that. That's I am learning. I'm learning some more things about Mark. So thank you.
Okay.
The story of Mark goes on.
Да. Let's move to the next pericope. Лариса, ничего, если прошу прочесть стихи 31-33 по-гречески.
Kai legei autois, deute humeis autoi kat ἰδίαν topon, kai anapausaste oligon, esangar goi erhomenoi, kai goi jupagantes poloi, kai udefagei eukairon, kai apelton entoploio eis eremon topon, kat ἰδίαν. Kai eidon autois jupagontas kai epegnasan poloi, kai pedze apopason ton polion synedramon ekei, kai proelton autus.
Спасибо. Ну вот вначале можем просто посмотреть на перевод, и я буду, безусловно, как и всегда, благодарен всем участникам нашего семинара за комментарии и предложения, связанные с переводом, да. Отправляетесь вы одни. Вот здесь, конечно же, для переводчика может быть проблема. В чем суть эмфасиса «юмейс аутой»? Да. Кат იდίαν, как бы одни, да. Эсеремон топон, безлюдное место. Анапаусисте олигон. Я не очень хорошо понимаю, в чем смысл эмфасиса вот в этом юмейс аутой. Я пробовал как-то по-русски делать эмфасис. Не просто отправляйтесь вы одни. Вот, но эмфасис — это такая штука, которую, как правило, лингвисты, филологи, комментаторы употребляют это слово тогда, когда видят, что что-то здесь с текстом происходит необычное, но не понимают, в чем же здесь смысл, да?
I have a question about your translation here. I can
Okay.
see you want to put emphasis on the humeis autoi, which is emphatic, right? So that's, but how about, is the odni, is that a full translation of kat ιδίαν?
Yes, this was, yes, одни should translate kat ιδίαν.
Because I mean, I'd say kat ιδίαν, it's one of it's a characteristic phrase in Mark, it occurs, there's several passages where he takes the disciples and segregates them by themselves, almost in a kind of secret way. And I'm just wondering if does adni convey that sense of he's kind of separating them off from the crowd?
Yes, I understand your idea before thinking whether the Russian translation here is okay or should be somehow changed. Can you suggest how would you try to render this particular dimension of the Greek ̈ηδίαν in English, for example?
I think I generally translated it by themselves. So maybe that's not, maybe that should be criticized in the same way I'm questioning οδνή. But I mean, I think it, it does have some implication of, you're forming a little sect, you're forming a little secret group. But I don't know. I'm not sure how to get that into, one or two words.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I think I translated it privately.
Okay. But I do not know how to translate English privately into Russian in this context.
Mm.
It's definitely not частным образом. Let's look at other occurrences of ̈ηδίαν in the Gospel of Mark. Do you see my screen with
You see the same screen right now.
the same screen? Okay, then let me change the screen.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, that's the first occurrence of ̈ηδίαν in Mark. Then in the next verse, we read that they followed Jesus' order and that they went to a desert place, ̈ηδίαν.
Yeah, and they're trying to escape from the crowd, right? So they're trying to be private and to, screen themselves off from others.
Yes, then the next occurrence of this is the story of one of Jesus' miracles, where the deaf one is brought to Jesus, and he wants to perform a miracle, not in public, but ̈ηδίαν. In Russian, наедине. What is especially important is that the scene of transfiguration is also said to have taken place ̈ηδίαν. He takes only these three disciples with him. Then after the transfiguration and the next miracle of Jesus, when he cast out a demon, the disciples asked Jesus, ̈ηδίαν, what was the reason that they couldn't do this? And also the eschatological discourse of John, of Jesus in Mark 13 is also introduced by the setting that he's setting ̈ηδίαν with his disciples.
Yeah, there's also, in addition, chapter 4, verse 10, I think, 10 or 11. where you don't have kata ィδίαν, but you have kata monos.
Мгм.
And, and that's, this is before the parable theory. He says the parable, then he takes the disciples kata monos, and he says, to you has been given the mystery, but not those outside. So there's definitely a sense of esoteric revelation.
Yes. Готе, да, again, это катамонос.
Yeah. And it's interesting that then in 9:2, you have both kata ィδίαν and monos, right? So that's like doubly emphatic before the transfiguration.
Okay. Thank you, John, because this is a remark that is also important for a translator, for a commentator, that here we have not just a word, but a whole set of scenes which also form belong to a special topic, the topic of secrecy, because this kat ἰδίαν or monos or katamonos, we see that it occurs in the most important places, like parables, transfiguration, or
Eschatological discourse.
theological discourse. Yes.
And
it would be nice to translate it in a unified way.
yeah, if you can, although Mark's usages are not totally unified. Kata monos in 4:11,
Okay.
kata ィδίαν monos in 9:2. But yeah, I think it goes with the picture of Jesus as somebody who says and does very important things that not everybody is allowed to see.
Но пока я не вижу, если говорить о русском переводе, лучшего варианта, чем все равно как-то оставлять здесь варьирующиеся слова «одни» или «наедине». Но, может быть, обязательно здесь в сопровождении какого-то комментария, типа того, что вот сейчас у нас здесь прозвучал, насчет того, что здесь у нас это не просто какое-то такое проходное выражение, а какая-то целая цепочка связанных друг с другом вещей, очень тематически важных для автора Евангелия. Еще один вопрос, который на самом деле, думаю, и для переводчика, и для читателя этого места релевантен, это то, что, как кажется, греческий текст 31 стиха, исходя из семантики второго лица множественного числа в греческом языке, предполагает, что речь о том, чтобы ученики, те, к кому Иисус обращается во втором лице, без говорящего куда-то пошли, и там они отдохнули. Девте, it's second person plural, anapausαστε, second person plural. It looks as if Jesus is not going to follow them or to take a rest with them. But then we see that, in fact, it's not a humeis, but a hemeis, not you, but we are going somewhere.
Mhm.
At first glance, this looks as some kind of a tension within the text. What would you like to say about this?
Let me think about it a second. So the tension is, all right, you've still got the screen up from before, so we're
Okay.
back in chapter 6, right?
Wait a second. We are going back to chapter 6. Yes. Now you see.
Yeah. So what is the tension again?
The tension is that if I say, for example, to my colleagues in this room, I ask you to go away and to have a rest,
Uh-huh.
then this would imply that the speaker, is not going to join them, because otherwise I wouldn't have used second plural.
Mhm.
Used first plural. Let's go.
Yeah.
And in fact, in other places, we have this form, first plural, when Jesus addresses his disciples, asking them, urging them to go with him somewhere.
Mhm. Yeah, I've never thought of that. Maybe it is a tension. I mean, yeah, I mean, if you say you go to the park, does that imply that I'm not going to the park with you? Well, maybe you're right. Frankly, I'm pretty good at detecting tensions within the text, and that this one never bothered me, but maybe it should.
Yes.
I mean, generally when Jesus is says something about İδίαν, the idea is that he wants to segregate the disciples from a larger group to be with him. So, I mean, I wonder if İδίαν by itself, conveys this idea of that I will be with you in this secret place. But no, it's a good question, which I need to think about some more.
Yeah, because we have quite a lot of other places where Jesus is asking, urging his disciples to go somewhere, and for example, Mark 4:35, which is quite close to our place. Yes. Kai legeo choice and a canete remera obsies gnamenes de eltomen eis peron. Let us go. The setting is almost the same. They are going to cross the sea and to go to another place in the boat. But here I think this the normal language, the normal way of saying, let us do something.
Yeah, that's a good point. And but what's your theory about why this awkwardness arose? I mean, I don't think we can say that this is because Mark has, some previous story that he's doing something with, because this is one of those linking passages. It links probably separate stories that he had, but this editorial connection, my theory is those are usually just composed by Mark out of his own head. It's editorial work. But maybe what it shows us is that Mark's own syntax sometimes is awkward. He's not the most fluid writer, and you can see when Matthew and Luke edit Mark, they smooth out some of these awkwardnesses. But I don't know, do you have a theory about where the awkwardness comes from? I'd like to.
I think that there is something in this construction that at least asks for explanation. The only thing that occurs to me, but probably maybe that's not right. That do you see here Mark 1:35?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, that's that sometimes when we see that something is being done in the Gospel of Mark, cut ̈ιδίαν, this includes Jesus and a close circle of his disciples, but sometimes he leaves his disciples. For example, in 1:35, yes, he goes by himself in as eremon topon, and his disciples then are to look after him. Or another passage, which is probably even more interesting, that's the story of Jesus who goes on the waters. Can you remain?
Immediately after this, in 6:45.
6. Yes, exactly. 6:45. 6:45. Yes.
So
Caetius enancasentus matetas autu embenei eis to ploion, kai pro agein eis to parent pros Sidon. Heus autos apoluei ton ochlon. So he sends them, but Jesus himself rests on the shore. Kai apotaxamenos autois appelten eis to oras proseuxastai. Once again, the same motive that we have in Mark 1. Yes, that the place that we just saw. He leaves the apostles and he goes completely monos, not monoi but monos, to pray in the mountain.
Yeah, I mean, of course, yeah, these stories, these introductions, they're setting up the rest of the story, so they're in the sea, he's on the land, how is he going to be reunited with them? It'll be by walking on the sea.
Yes, and we see later what happened. He had to reunite with them by walking on the waters. And this makes me think that maybe in Mark 6:31, when he asks his disciples to go to another place in the boat, and I think that the implication of using second plural here is that he is going to remain here while sending them away in the boat. Maybe at that point, at that juncture in the plot.
Yeah,
Mark-
there's no boat here though.
Sorry?
There's no boat in 6:30 and 31.
No boat, but the boat appears in the next
And yeah, 6:32. Yeah.
6:32. So it looks as if verses 6:31 and 6:32 tells us that following Jesus' command, the disciples go somewhere without Jesus in a boat.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And I mean, actually, you could say, you know, if you didn't have the intervening stuff, you would say this is the beginning of the story of Jesus walking on the water.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking about. Maybe at this juncture in writing his story, Mark wanted to proceed to the miracle of Jesus walking on the waters,
Mhm.
and the beginning of the story that she started to write was pointing towards this continuation of the story. But then later on, Mark, as the gospel writer, decided that at this point, at this juncture in the story, he should introduce the story of miracle feeding of the people with bread and fish.
Yeah, that's a good theory. I like that. And
then in Mark 6:45, he resumes the story that he wanted to start in Mark 6:31, but later abandoned in favor of a different turn in the plot.
yes, that it makes a lot of sense. It almost seems obvious, but I don't recall ever having thought this myself or seen it in secondary literature. So maybe I have seen it and forgotten, but it makes a lot of sense. I like that.
Я кратко подведу резюме под нашей дискуссией. Мне кажется необычным, что в Марк 6:31 Иисус говорит ученикам: пойдите вы одни в пустынное место и отдохните немного. Да? По нормам русского языка, английского языка, греческого языка. Тогда, когда говорящий обращается к кому-то во втором лице множественного числа, идите вы туда-то и туда-то, то подразумевается, что сам я, говорящий, скорее всего, с вами не пойду. Иначе было сказано: давайте мы с вами вместе куда-то пойдем. И дальнейшее продолжение этой истории Марк 6:32 тоже вроде бы продолжает эту же самую идею. Хотя здесь, конечно же, третье лицо множественного числа может приниматься как эксклюзивно, что Иисус не входил в число тех, кто отправились в пустынное место в волке дни, так и то, что он входил. Но дальше мы однозначно видим, что Иисус таки, хотя он вроде бы отправил учеников во втором множественного числа, идите, отправляйтесь, Иисус оказывается вместе с учениками. Окей, это несколько необычное использование второго лица множественного числа, но дальше мы видим 6:45 нечто очень похожее. Иисус понудил учеников своих войти в лодку, отправиться на другую сторону. Сам он с ними не отправляется. Вот. Они плывут в лодке, и он, видя, что на море буря и ветер противный, идет к ним по воде, да? И у меня возникла мысль, предположение. Вот Джоэль отметил, что он этой идеи не встречал в комментариях или secondary literature, хотя она кажется очень интересной и красивой. Возможно, вот здесь вот, в этот момент написания своего Евангелия, Марк 6:31, автор Евангелия как бы начал писать ту историю, которая будет написана позже, Марк 6:45 и дальше, про то, как, отправив сначала учеников через море, Иисус потом, сказать, догоняет их, идя по воде. Но начав писать эту историю, евангелист как бы меняет свои писательские планы, что здесь нужно все-таки перед тем, как писать про это, упомянуть про чудесное умножение хлебов и рыб. Он говорит про чудесное умножение хлебов и рыб, а дальше, как только эта история кончается, вот снова у нас возвращается к сюжету учеников, которые отправлены куда-то дальше. Если мы спрашиваем, задумываемся, как перевести вот это в прямую речь, «Этеус enankas entus metetas autu benei estoploion, kai pro again», как вот это описание перевести, что он должен был сказать, чтобы понудить учеников своих пойти в лодку и отправиться на другой берег, то, наверное, вот что-то вроде такого. Deutа gemeis auto как იდίαν. Вот.
If you're right about this, then we can see Mark in the process of creating another Markan sandwich, right?
Yes, though here it is a bit different kind of sandwich, because the second part of the sandwich is not a direct continuation of the first part of the sandwich, but it is rather a second attempt to start what was started in the first part of sandwich, but then abandoned in favor of what is inside the sandwich.
Yeah, I know it's not exactly the same, but still, if your theory is correct, you have Mark intercalating, putting between the beginning of a story and then the continuation of that story. So that, I think I like that a lot, because you can actually, maybe see him doing what we suspect that he's been doing all along. It's very good.
Thank you. It's a very
I think you have a future in Markan studies.
yes. It's interesting that while discussing the Gospel of Mark, we from time to time come to points which seems to have been untouched by Markan studies. despite thousands of books. It's it, and this I think this is especially important for our students, because from time to time my students ask me, in the biblical studies, or at least in the New Testament studies, is there something still unresearched? And I think that we can say yes. There are some points that can be still thought about and discussed.
Yes, for those who have eyes to see, let them see.
Yes, thank you. Да.
Well, and it reminds me of one thing my doctoral advisor said to me, that the most important thing in exegesis is coming up with the right exegetical questions, seeing what the problems are in the text, because we're so used to these texts and we think, they make perfect sense, but then, when you start to think about them, sometimes, and I've read this many, many times, I've never seen that problem, but now that you pointed out to me, it's obvious that it's a problem. But so the critical point is coming up with the questions and not trying to answer them too quickly, but just sitting with the questions and seeing what the problems are.
Okay, thank you. Это вопрос на самом деле настолько интересный, про то, что не наблюдаем ли мы здесь, собственно, буквально в прямом эфире, можно сказать, за процессом написания Евангелия от Марка, как автор начинает писать какую-то тему, потом отклоняется, потом возвращается к тому, с чего начинал сначала, что, может быть, даже было бы интересно, если бы не только эта тема обсуждалась в диалоге между мной и Джоэлем, но, может быть, и кто-то из наших участников нашего семинара хотел бы что-то сказать про контра или по поводу этих стихов. Это же действительно страшно любопытно, потому что, да, какое-то такое окошко, если я прав, какое-то такое окошко на писательскую стратегию автора самого раннего из дошедших до нас Евангелий. Есть какие-нибудь еще выступления или речения участников нашей сегодняшней встречи? Лариса, ничего не хотите сказать?
Павел Георгиевич, я хочу сказать, но немножко про другое, про то место, когда вы сказали, что когда собрались к нему апостолы, если сейчас мы завершим то, о чем говорилось, и вы мне позволите.
Окей, конечно.
Вы сказали, что перед этим Марк сказал, что поставил 12, которых и назвал апостолами. Но дело в том, что это удивительная особенность Марка, что у него никогда не бывает 12 апостолов, 12 учеников или чего-то подобного. Всегда бывает просто додека или гой додека. Если вы мне дадите показать экран, если можно.
Конечно. Сейчас, секундочку.
Угу.
Да, у вас есть право.
Угу. Сейчас видно?
Да, прекрасно видно.
Смотрите, то, что у меня в 14 стихе от Марка заштриховано серым, это результат гармонизации, видимо, этого стиха по Луке. Потому что Марк, который употребляет числительное додека, если не ошибаюсь, 10 раз, и первый раз в этом месте, в 13-14, никогда не прибавляет никакого существительного к нему. То есть это для него какой-то важный экклезиологический момент. Об этом было много споров в рамках критики редакций, почему так и что так, почему Марк так. Но вот это, вероятно, Марк уподобляет церковь Новому Израилю, да, и поэтому вот это делает акцент на 12. И это, видимо, не очень хорошо с точки зрения языка, вот так вот, эпоэсен додека, потому что, вот видите, Матфей пишет уже туз додека матетас, да, а Лука пишет додека гус кай апостолюс ономасен, вот. Но во всех тех 10 случаях, когда додека есть у Марка, никогда не бывает это, кто эти додека. То есть такое впечатление, что на фоне он как-то отделяет их от учеников, потому что есть ученики, и есть вот эти вот, среди них есть эти додека. И поэтому в этом большой вопрос, кто же возвратился. Конечно, это сэндвич, вот, и возвратились апостолы, чтобы рассказать, как у них все замечательно получилось. Вот. Но большой вопрос, нет ли тут тоже шва какого-то, что идет ли речь о 12 или может быть, о более широком круге. Вот, спасибо.
Спасибо, Лариса. Это действительно замечательно, что вы сказали. Лариса, а что мы сейчас видим на экране? Это у вас некоторый такой заголовок, не заголовок, а какие-то наброски какой-то вашей работы по Марку. Такое ощущение, что...
Ну, скорее по теме ученики, потому что я пыталась разобраться вот с учениками, с апостолами, и вот с 3 апостолами, то, что называется the three, вот, Иаков, Иоанн и Петр, вот, и, ну, может быть.
Я помню, что в какой-то момент вы взяли на себя такое домашнее задание, вот разобраться с темой учеников. То есть это подготовка вашего доклада про учеников, который мы когда-то услышим в более полном виде, чем то, что мы услышали сейчас.
Да, Михаил что-то оно.
Спасибо, Лариса.
I noticed that in my commentary, I didn't translate these words, and I have a note on it in which I say that, I mean, the attestation is good, you know, for the whom they also called apostles, but some manuscripts leave it out, and I guess I concluded that it was an assimilation to Luke.
Mm-hmm.
And the only other time that Mark uses the word is in 6:30, where you know, it's not entirely clear that apostolos has this big magnified significance that it has, you know, in the later texts, in Paul and in Luke. So it may not be part of the original text in chapter 3.
If we take away the name, the term ἀπόστολοι in Mark 3:14, which is included in square brackets, and which Joel, in his own translation and commentary, has left out, then the verse that we dealt with today, Mark 6:30, is the only one occurrence for the term ἀπόστολοι in the whole Gospel of Mark.
But without the word the 12.
But
Just
without,
apostle.
yes,
Right.
but
Yeah,
without
that's
this
interesting.
dodecahedron.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and of course, yeah, that plays into the whole debate about, you know, the meaning of apostolos, you know, elsewhere in the New Testament, and is it always coterminous with the 12?
So the reader of the Gospel of Mark, having met the word apostolos, now the noun apostolos, for the first time in Mark 6:30, should have had some key to understand whom the Gospel writer was referring to, and probably the only key for this was supplied by the verb apostolein that we have in 6:7. Hyperscalated dodeka and erxota autus apostelein duo. And then in the second part of the sandwich, he refers to this dodeka as apostoloi, having in mind this verb. So this means that in his lexicon, which is strange, by the way, but in his lexicon, apostolos is not yet a terminus technicus.
Yeah, maybe, though, I mean, Paul is a lot earlier than Mark,
Yeah.
and he's
Yes.
already using it as a terminus. So maybe it was, I mean, I don't think you can necessarily assume that the readers are coming to what Mark is saying with a blank slate, tabula rasa, and this becomes important at the end of the gospel, where there's a question about whether Mark narrates resurrection appearances, or just ends it with the women running away. But even if he doesn't describe them, don't the readers know about them, from just being Christians? So, I mean, it is, again, it's a really good question. Is he assuming the technical significance, but just not doing much with it? Is it invoked by his uses of the verb apostello? Or is he deliberately avoiding the term? So.
Yes, that's exactly the question that I wanted to raise, because, of course, it seems that I mean, it's the mainstream in Markan scholarship that both Mark and his audience, they belonged to that trend, to that group within the early Christianity that was linked with the legacy of Paul, so that and within Paul's letters, the genuine Paul's letters, the term apostolos is so prominent that it would be strange if Mark and his audience were ignorant of this. But still, Mark construes his narrative as if apostolos is not terminus technicus, but just a reference to this erxot apostelein in 6:7.
And maybe there's a relationship between the fact that Mark, he's the most negative about the disciples of Jesus of any of the gospel writers, and he also avoids the term apostolos, which, as you say, he should have known, in its technical significance from Paul. But he's also the most negative about the 12. So maybe that's why he avoids it, if he's avoiding it.
Yeah, so exactly what you said. One may ask whether this has something to do with his negative, or almost negative evaluation.
Yeah.
Of the institute of apostles.
Yeah, the institution of the apostles. Yeah. Yeah.
Я кратко дам некий итог нашей дискуссии здесь. Совершенно справедливо Лариса обратила наше внимание на то, что вот вообще всего слово апостол встречается в Евангелии от Марка дважды. Марк 3:14 и 6:30. Но при этом в 3:14, сейчас видно экран, да?
Да.
При этом в 3:14 это «хускай апостолус ономасен», взято в скобки, и несмотря на хорошее подтверждение в рукописях, очень правдоподобно представляет собой, является гармонизацией с Евангелием от Луки, где вот так и говорится «додека гускай апостолус ономасен». А в Марке ряд, пускай небольшой, но и значимый, рукописей эти слова опускает. Если действительно считать, что это у нас есть гармонизация с Лукой, то получается, что у нас единственное место вообще для слова апостолы встречаются в Евангелии от Марка, это Марк 6:30. Причем это мы только что видели, у нас вторая часть того, что мы называем сэндвичем, да? Мы посмотрим, а что же у нас происходит в первой части сэндвича. Вот, а в первой части сэндвича у нас, как бы предваряя вот, использование этого слова апостолы, у нас есть глагол апостеллой, да? Иисус начинает посылать вот этих самых 12 подвое, да? То есть, хотя с одной стороны, вот, думаю, что простите, практически никто не сомневается в современной науке, что и сам автор Евангелия от Марка, и его аудитория принадлежали вот к той школе, к тому движению внутри раннего христианства, которое было связано с апостолом Павлом. А для Павла слово апостол, несомненно, такой очень важный терминус техникус, технический термин, вот, который означает именно вот, посланник Христа, который обладает некоторой властью Христом данной. Но Марк это слово употребляет один единственный раз, и то вводит его таким образом, как будто бы это не было какой-то уже всем известный терминус техникус, а вот оно просто вот здесь у нас на глазах он его, так сказать, создает, отталкиваясь от глагола апостелы. Апостол, вот, имеется в виду те, кого в 6:7 Иисус эрксата апостелой. Вот, и вопрос, который с этим встает, насколько можно связать вот это как бы неиспользование в Евангелии от Марка слова апостолос в качестве терминус техникус с тем достаточно как бы негативным изображением вот, апостолов, учеников Христовых, которые мы видим в Евангелии от Марка. И чем дальше вот, будем читать это Евангелие, тем больше будем видеть вот эту особенность того, как в Евангелии от Марка перед нами предстают ближайшие ученики Иисуса. Окей?
I just add, I mean, who was and who was not an apostle in early Christianity was a matter of controversy, because I think, Paul didn't invent the term either. It was already there. It's already there in the formula in 1 Corinthians 15. Then he appeared to all of the apostles. But Paul, I think Paul's claiming the title of apostle, even though, he wasn't one of the followers of Jesus during his lifetime, was controversial. And his insistence that he is an apostle was, I'm sure not everybody agreed with it. Right? So it's a matter of dispute and controversy, who is an apostle and who isn't. It's a, it appears in polemical context sometimes.
Да, это очень важный тоже момент, о котором говорит Джоэль, который я сейчас тоже кратко просуммирую. по-русски, что, вообще-то говоря, у нас вот в том употреблении слова апостол, которое мы видим в посланиях Павла, это не совсем то употребление слова апостол, которое мы видим, например, вот уже в тех Евангелиях, которые эксплицитно отождествляют апостолов и 12. Да? В посланиях апостола Павла Павел говорит о том, что я являюсь апостолом, я Павел. Кроме того, он говорит про других апостолов, которые тоже несут евангельскую весть по разным частям римской ойкумены, но при этом, как кажется, далеко не везде предполагается, что вот эти апостолы, которые являются, с одной стороны, сотрудниками в каком-то смысле Павла, с другой стороны, его соперниками, что не относятся к числу этих 12. Да? То есть у Павла в его письмах апостол, да, это термин, принятый ранней церковью, но не факт, что речь идет именно вот про этих 12, про эти додека. Вот. И это может объяснять нам тоже вот здесь ситуацию с Марком. Он, в отличие от, скажем, Матфея и Луки, которые проводят вот здесь приравнивание вот понятия апостолы и 12. Марк здесь употребляет слово апостол только вот в одном этом месте, как производное глагола апостелло.
It's interesting. Just one more thing. I'm realizing I'm talking a lot and we're past the time. But even in Luke, even in the book of Acts, which has a lot of stories about Paul, generally the apostoloi are the 12. There's only one or two passages in which I think there's one in which Barnabas and Paul are apostoloi, and that may mean that they've been sent out by another church, right? Rather than the technical term.
Да, даже в деяниях, которые, в общем говоря, относятся, конечно же, именно к традиции того движения, которое восходит к апостолу Павлу, вот у нас здесь слово апостол употребляется практически как терминус техникус по отношению к 12 гойдодека. И это отличается, так сказать, действительно деяния от послания апостола Павла. In this regard, the Acts are different from Paul's letters.
Exactly, yeah. Even though Luke, he obviously thinks Paul is a really important figure, but he generally doesn't call him an apostle.
Though,
Okay, so yeah, this is the one, 14:14, but I think you could interpret this as them having been sent out by the church wherever they have just been. I think there's just this one exception, and it's Paul and Barnabas.
mm-hmm. Yes, in the next chapter, in 15:2, it seems that the very language of this verse, the syntax of this verse, rather presupposes that Paulos and Barnabas are not among the
Yeah.
Apostoli, because they are being sent prostus apostolos.
Mhm.
And the very last occurrence of this word in Acts, that the Christian missionaries ask the faithful to follow τα δόγματα, τα κεκριμένα υπό των Αποστόλων και Πρεσβυτέρων των εν Ιερουσαλήμοis.
Mhm.
This addition to an Hierosolymos seems to limit the
Mhm.
circle of apostles and elders whose teaching is to be followed to those in Jerusalem.
Mhm.
So you are right. Act 14:14 is the only place in Acts
Mhm.
where people outside of the circle of 12 are called apostoli.
Yeah, so I think the conclusion is there were different definitions of apostolos, some more restrictive than others, that were circulating in early Christianity. And Paul has a problem because he wants to claim this term for himself, even though he wasn't one of the original 12, and even though he had some dissension with the group in Jerusalem, headed by James, who also wasn't a follower of Jesus during his lifetime, but who was already apparently included in the circle of the apostles, by some, or by many within the church early on, because you have that back in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul is citing a formula about resurrection appearances, which probably goes back to before him. So
Can we ask ourselves whether Mark's non-usage of the word apostoloi with regard to the 12 is different to the usage of Luke can be regarded as a kind of as a sign that Mark was somehow of some polemics in Mark's gospel with regard to the notion of apostleship as an institution that we have in Acts and Luke, so that within the heritage of Paul we have different interpretations. One interpretation that looks at apostleship, regards apostleship more as an institution, quite fixed institution, 12 apostles, and another tendency presented by Mark, which was probably quite deliberately trying not to use this word, at least in its meaning as terminus technicus.
well, yeah, I think maybe what I'd prefer to say is, as you say, Mark is maybe deliberately avoiding the term, and Paul is trying to broaden the term, so that they're both directed maybe against the institution of the 12, but Mark is avoiding it and Paul is redefining it to include himself.
Paul is redefining the notion of apostle, or the tradition that limited apostleship to Roi Dodeka was redefining the earlier understanding of apostolos.
Well, that would be an alternate interpretation, and in favor of that, again, 1 Corinthians 15:9 or whatever it is, James is one of the 12. James is one of the apostles. And as I said, most people take this as a list of resurrection appearances that is from before Paul. 1 Corinthians 15:7. And what Paul really wants to emphasize here is the next verse, last to me. The last of the apostles.
Yes. Okay. We haven't done a new pericope as it was planned at the beginning, but I think that we discussed at least two very important topics, namely whether the fact that in Mark 6, verse 30, I believe, yeah? No, 6:31. Jesus' address to his disciples in second person plural is a sign that at that point, at that juncture in his narrative, he planned to go directly to the miracle of Jesus walking on the waters, and the problem of what is the meaning of the usage of the word apostola in Mark. Мы с двумя вещами здесь очень интересными сегодня все-таки встретились, задумались над ними. Это над употреблением слова апостол, апостолы в ранних христианских разных традициях, в частности, у апостола Павла, с другой стороны, в диалогии Лука Деяния и у Марка. Это одна вещь. Вторая вещь, которая, вот, мне кажется, очень действительно интересная, про это говорили. Вот это второе лицо множественного числа, как бы исключающее Иисуса, Марк 6:31, и не является этот стих своего рода предваряющим то, что мы видим в Марк 6:45. Спасибо всем, кто с нами сегодня был. И Джоэлю, прежде всего, Джоэль.
And now I send you out to your beds.
Okay.
And I send myself out to my lunch.
Yes, but in Moscow we usually go to bed much later than this.
Okay. Well, I'll send you out to your
Working desks.
vodka. Okay. All right.
No, not vodka. Working desks.
Okay, whatever. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
До свидания.
До свидания.
До свидания. Спасибо.
Спасибо.